Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
A couple of things I wanted to talk about today. Let's start with Microsoft Entra Private Access. And so Entra Private Access is one of the new solutions from Microsoft as part of the Secure Edge SASE or SSE product of things. And what it does is it allows you to do a couple of things. Mainly, it's one of the solutions that I think Microsoft has really kind of avoided for a lot of years, like network-based, like VPN solution. And so it is kind of a modern secure edge solution where you can access applications that are on-premise from a remote location, and it's like micro-segmented. So you're only going to access the application that you are authorized for rather than creating a full tunnel of traffic and providing all of that, network traffic. Instead of being fully on the network, it is just stitching together like a micro tunnel from the user's endpoint to the application itself. One of the announcements that was recently published in the Microsoft Community Hub is that Entra Private Access for on-premise users, you can now use it to enforce granular app segmentation and MFA for any on-premise resource, authenticating to a domain controller for on-premise users across all devices and protocols without granting full network access. So you can also protect your domain controllers from any identity threats and prevent unauthorized access by simply enabling privileged access to the DCs by enforcing MFA and privileged identity management. Now, this is important because traditionally we've thought of SSEs as remote users authenticating to a corporate network that is on-premise. In this specific case, if your users are on-premise and you want to grant access to an application, or like say DC here, a domain controller, and force them to use MFA or some sort of privileged identity management, you can do that using Entra Private Access and not have to, stitch together any other solution to make it work. So the access can be blocked by policy when you enable this privileged access through Entra Private Access. And the traffic itself, the way that it's architectured, there is a secure access client that is installed on the endpoints. The authentication traffic is routed to Microsoft Entra ID. And there's a private access cloud that we're using for that authentication. So only the auth traffic goes through the cloud. The app traffic will stay on-premise. The user is prompted for MFA because private access can extend that MFA to all on-premises resources. And you can enable that granular app segmentation so that the user is only interacting with services they're authorized to access. So you can limit the user to specific applications or resources via Entra Private Access. There is a connector that has to be deployed, which talks back to the private access cloud. And there's a private access DC agent that is used to exchange that Kerberos ticket. Again, only the auth traffic goes and leaves the CorpNet. All the app traffic remains local. Now, this is a great announcement because for most Entra customers, there's no additional licensing required. Remember, this is for on-premise users who are going to use Entra Private Access for MFA to an on-premise resource. No additional licensing required. When you use Entra Private Access remotely to access applications on-prem, so if I'm a remote user and I need that VPN access, right, then there is a licensing component to that Entra Private Access that is required. So really great stuff. If you're looking for that MFA solution for your on-premise apps, or even just to like say access a domain controller, this is something that you should start looking into.
I celebrated my 7th anniversary at Microsoft 2 months ago. And I think this is one of the very first things customers started asking me about when I met with customers was, hey, we want to gate access to this thing on premises with multi-factor authentication. How do we do that? And we've never really had a good story around that. There's been some third-party vendors that have had varying levels of solutions for that. A lot of them get uncomfortable because you're inserting third-party code into first-party authentication flows and authorization flows. This allows you to do it natively with Microsoft tooling. And to be able to do that with no additional licensing for scenarios where you're already on premises, accessing something on premises, that's really interesting and a great way to dip your toe in the proverbial water and try it out. So, Andy, I think you gave a great summary. I'm not sure I have a lot to add here, other than I will just add a little more detail. There's really kind of two, don't call them twin products, maybe fraternal twins, coming to market here in the coming months. Entra Private Access, which Andy kind of talked about, and Entra Internet Access. And you can think of those, like Andy said, as an SSE, SASE, Secure Service Edge type solution. Private access, of course, is for those on-premises, unique to your company line of business apps. Internet access is how do we get a little more visibility and control into all of the access our users are doing to internet-facing applications like SaaS, as an example. So cool stuff coming to market, and here's a way you can try it out, most likely with your existing licensing. So check out the blog post. We'll have it in the show notes, and keep your eyes and ears open as you'll hear more announcements on this as these programs become generally available here in the coming months over the summer and fall.
I'll just add a side note as well, since you mentioned the Entra Internet Access. Both of these solutions, customers have been asking, I know they've been asking me, they probably have been asking you too, Adam, about network-based conditional access. And so a lot of organizations use network-based conditions to ask their users or see if their users are coming through, and then they provide certain either security controls or exemptions to security controls based on those network identifiers. So are you coming from a corporate egress IP, or are you on this particular network? And so when we talk about that zero trust model, network-based conditional access, for the most part, is not part of that model, or it shouldn't be, because we know that networks can get breached. And so if you specifically are looking at your corp net and you have your egress IPs and you exempt security controls based on those conditions, you've then removed a security barrier to something that is easily compromised from a attacker's standpoint. And so now you're not zero trust. This is a way, and you should look into this, because these SASE solutions are a way to provide those network-based security controls and conditional access without having to exempt security controls. And so there are a few SASE solutions out there. But what you're doing is essentially offloading some of that risk to a solutions provider. Just like with any SaaS app, you're offloading that risk and you're routing your traffic through that solution, whether it be Entra Internet Access or Zscaler or some other cloud that is a SASE solution. You're routing your traffic through there. And then you could say, okay, if it is coming from one of those nodes, one of their data centers, one of Microsoft's data centers, one of Zscaler's data centers, then I will trust that authentication. And so you're offloading that risk, because it is probably harder for a solution provider like that to get compromised. Not impossible, but a lot harder than your CorpNet on your company, data center. So something to think about, because it just adds another layer where you can say, I'm going to trust it if it's coming from this proxy that is provided by my solution rather than my own egress IP.
One of many signals you can use to make decisions. And I think in general, as you're moving away from traditional legacy security approaches to a modern zero trust approach, you realize there is no one true signal. There's no one signal to rule them all that says, well, now I trust this. You're going to use the combination of everything you can divine about that connection attempt, that authentication attempt, and make a decision over, are you going to apply additional scrutiny? Are you going to apply additional controls, and so on? And where you're almost taking it from is from that previous mindset, which was the egress IP is the one ring to rule them all, to, if you are coming from one of these solutions, that is a factor, one of many signals I'm looking for to develop trust in that connection at that time. And I'll still look at other factors along with it too. So I think it still lends itself well to a zero trust type approach, because in general, when you're on those sorts of solutions, you're not treating it as, well, that's all I need to know to fully trust it.
Great call out. Thanks, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
So the next thing I want to talk about is Endpoint Privilege Management. And this is something that's from Microsoft that is part of the Intune Suite, or correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, I think you can purchase it separately as well.
You can, yes. Endpoint Privilege Management is available standalone.
And so it was recently announced that support approved elevations are now available. But let's talk about what Endpoint Privilege Management is first. It is a feature that allows administrators to set policy for standard users to perform tasks that are usually reserved for an admin. And you can designate an app or a process that allow users to perform a privileged action without having to give them complete local admin. And so that really limits the scope of what you're trying to do, right? You may have a software developer or some other, I've had like SharePoint administrators that need a specific application that requires privileged or elevated permissions. Or maybe an engineer, right? I've also had like engineers that use like SolidWorks, and then they need some sort of privileged access or elevation when it runs something. And so the default mode for many years is just, okay, we'll just give them local admin, whether it's local admin with a specific user that is designated as local admin rather than their regular user, or you just give the regular user local admin. That provides them with a ton of permissions. And with EPM, Endpoint Privilege Management, you can just designate a single application or process that is essentially allowed to execute in privileged mode for that specific user.
Let me go a little further, Andy. One other thing unique to Intune EPM is that when those applications run in that elevated context, they don't run as Andy Jaws now an admin. They run as a virtual user that's completely spun up for the purpose of running that app in an elevated state. And then that user is destroyed when the app is closed. So you don't have the risk of anything in that user context suddenly being allowed to elevate when that user or that application now runs in a different context. So it's even more secure from that sense, even compared to some other solutions out there, because you don't have that risk of anything in user context coming along for the ride, essentially hitching a ride up the elevation chain to admin, because it instantiates that virtual user to run that app in that elevated state.
And so as these solutions roll out, Microsoft is continuing continually adding things. And so one of these things is now the support approved elevation, where a standard user, if they encounter something that requires elevated permissions, they can request support approval directly from the application context menu. The end user will have to provide a business justification for the request. And then the IT admins can review that request and approve or deny it within the Intune admin portal. So it just kind of smooths it out. You can just do it right within the application. Maybe you had to do it previously or part of ServiceNow or whatever, but now it's very smooth and within the context of the applications menu. So really great feature. Allows the whole process to be a lot smoother.
For the most part, admins had to somewhat predict what users were going to want to elevate in the past and build all those rule sets into the solution ahead of time. This now allows more of that real-time, hey, I need to do this thing, can I run it elevated? As opposed to admins having to build it all out ahead of time. So this is much more of a organic workflow that you see happen as well. In addition to all the scenarios Andy laid out where we already know about them. We know we have these 5 line of business apps. The developers left the company 15 years ago. They're written in some ancient version of like Visual Basic or something, who knows? And they still run a core component of our business and they have to run this admin. So we're just going to look for the signature of it or the path name of it or this or that, and always allow it to run elevated. This is a different scenario where maybe I'm installing a one-off and I need admin privilege so I can install it, run the installer. I would use this here.
The final thing I just wanted to mention is kind of fun. Twitter has always been a big part of InfoSec. Even through the ups and downs, I still use it mostly sporadically these days to catch up on InfoSec news and current events. And one of the things that was just recently announced is that the Twitter domain is going to be officially retired after 17 years, and all the URLs are going to be transitioned to x.com. And so users are going to be redirected to X if they're using the outdated Twitter domain. And I hope that redirect is going to continue because I'm sure there's a ton of links out there that are embedded somewhere or part of some process. And if they stop that redirect, it'll probably break a lot of links in the process. So hopefully that redirect will continue, but just wanted to mention because it's something that I think a lot of InfoSec folks use on a day-to-day basis.
Even with how impetuous the leadership team over there tends to be, they would have to keep that domain around for a couple of years. I would have to think. They have been looking at ways to cut costs, and we've talked about them on the show, like when they stopped supporting SMS two-factor authentication, basically because they were paying too much money to, who was it, Twilio or whomever their service provider was. On a whim, essentially, a month in, just boom, we're not doing this anymore. So definitely impetuous leadership team. I think wants to put that name behind them, but to your point, Andy, so many embedded links, embedded URLs, embedded images, blah, 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 across the internet would break and they would lose essentially a revenue stream because those users aren't clicking into the service anymore. So I imagine we'll see the redirect for some time. I refuse to stop calling it Twitter. I know there's a ton of people that are in the same boat. X just is so lame. I just can't get over it. But I will say, overall, the service has stabilized. And, again, we'll see if the impetuous leadership team over there gets bored and moves on at some point sooner than later. I have to think that's coming because the other businesses are suffering as a result of it. And the divided attention is harming things like SpaceX and Tesla and those sorts of things. So I imagine eventually this experiment will come to an end, but who knows?
Yeah, I still call it Twitter. I'm not going to call it X because nobody will know what I'm talking about.
Right. I mean, it's still every place everywhere has to say X, the service formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. We'll have the links to the things that we talked about in our show notes, as well as our contact information if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.